I'm just going to kind of go through these and, feel free to jump in and ask questions or ask for clarification or go in the direction that fits more your data plan. So this is just a little bit about me. I work for the Open Campus and Juntos program, which primarily focuses on college access for Latino youth and families around Oregon. I have a public health background, which is where I learned program evaluation. And so a lot of how I approach public health and look at even questions around education, access, equity, things like that are from a public health lens. So that'll probably be apparent. And sort of the big picture question that I get and when I'm asking or answering in my work is how do we know Juntos is working, which seems pretty aligned with some of the framework that Deborah presented for you. And in addition to doing program evaluation, I handle other data things like our working with our clearinghouse data, program registrations, things like that. So I'm generally the data lady. And just to give you just a little bit more of my context about the kind of evaluation and surveys I do, the Juntos evaluation is primarily a post survey for participants in the program. Way back in the day, we used to do a pre-post survey, which you may get into in another session, is kind of a pain. And we decided that for our purposes, doing something retrospective was just served ourselves and our participants better. Our survey is available both on paper and online in the participant's choice of English or Spanish, and we have a parent survey and a student survey. So there's a lot of moving parts to coordinate, but it is worth it to from that cultural responsiveness and from that practical standpoint that upfront work that we put in really does make it a better survey experience for everyone. And we are very conscious in our program of cultural responsiveness, particularly things around language access, literacy access, as well as being responsible stewards of our data. We know that we are working with populations that have been marginalized, have had their data not taken such good care of. So we're very respectful of that. And the evaluation that we do focuses mostly on learning and behavior outcomes for our program. Plus, we look at things like school and community context as well. So, surveys. What is a survey? And if you attended our evaluation session at Extension Annual Conference, some of these slides may look a bit familiar. So a survey is, as Leanne ever so greatly put it, is any method for gathering information about responses to predetermined questions. And that's where surveys tend to be a little bit different from the other evaluation methods that you've been learning about and from a sample of people. And so why survey? Deborah spoke a little bit about that earlier. It, even though it's maybe not the most exciting method, you do have the advantage of it's usually, standardization where you have, the same questions that you're asking everyone and you're asking them generally in the same format. And it's really good for measuring either change over time, differences between groups, things like that. And so that's why surveys are very useful. So again, this is a very unscientific overview of how I approach surveys or any evaluation, but particularly surveys. There's the big question of, what do you want to know? Very, very broadly speaking, you usually start with, is this program working or is it successful? And then we dig a little bit deeper into what does that mean? But generally speaking, what do you want to know? And then who holds that information? If you want to, for example, know about students' attitudes towards outdoor school, you wouldn't do a teacher survey. And then how can you ask that, or what's the best way? And that's where you may land on surveys, you may land on something else, or you may land on what we call mixed methods, which is incorporating different methods, which is generally, especially for a large evaluation, what you do so you can get the best of all the worlds. And so most of these technical slides, I'm going in a very, very high level overview because almost any of these slides could be their own 30-minute breakout session. But some of the highlights to think about when you're planning and designing a survey, and I have included some more slightly more in-depth evaluation manuals that give you a little bit more information about surveys. But generally speaking, when you're thinking about or planning doing a survey, and I'd say the delivery, even though it's one of the last things that you do, I think in my experience is worth thinking about early on in the process, because a lot of these questions either take more thought or consideration than you might initially think about, or would potentially impact how you would design the survey. For example, if you don't have a lot of time, you would probably err on the side of creating a shorter survey, things like that. So plan for when and how people will take the survey. Is it something that's part of your program or being sent out afterwards? how long to devote for the survey and be realistic. It usually takes longer than you anticipate. Um, Deborah mentioned staff or volunteer capacity, and do they need special training, especially if you're doing a remote program like outdoor school where you as the program evaluator might not be there all the time. Do you need to train the volunteers or the staff that are doing the survey? Are there any conflicts of interest? And special considerations, things like protecting privacy and confidentiality, being careful about asking sensitive questions, things that might upset folks, or is potentially identifying data, or any conflict of interest. And, that's always something to consider when you're doing a program evaluation in particular. There's usually, the person that's designing the survey, what is their, what are their motivations? How do they benefit from how the program looks? And you can never fully eliminate any conflict of interest, particularly in program evaluation. It's, kind of just a fact of life, but you really do want to minimize things and keep things as objective as possible. So survey design, this is another slide that I borrowed from Leanne because I think she put it perfectly. The question stem, that's getting back to the what do you want to know, just a little bit more refined version of what do you want to know. And then the big decision tree that you usually make in surveys are closed-ended. That's usually something like a matrix table or select from a drop-down list or strongly agree, that they're selecting predetermined responses versus open-ended, which may be something more like, what did you like best about this program? And so this is relying on the narrative response. And of course, both methods have their pros and cons. Close-ended, of course, you're somewhat restricting the answers that people can give, but that can be useful for data analysis. Open-ended, of course, you're getting the respondent's own words or versions, which is helpful sometimes, or sometimes it really is more helpful just to have from your predetermined list. This is another resource that Leanne shared. This is a partial checklist. The book that she linked has like 3 pages of things to look out for when you're designing a survey question. The things that I want to focus on is question design is centered around respondent experience. I think that's very important to make sure that what you're asking and how you're framing a question, particularly in a program evaluation context, really is asking about how the participant went through the program. For example, if you're asking about logistics, making sure, you're saying what time of day that, it's, reflecting when the person is actually doing the program. Question worded to support respondent understanding. That means, again, using terminology and frames of reference that that your respondents would be familiar with. For example, if you're talking about outdoor school, you would probably want to make sure you're spelling out outdoor school and not using an abbreviation. Close-ended questions feature appropriate instructions and response options. That's going to be like, if you say, how much do you agree with this statement? Make sure that the scale points say disagree to strongly agree, because you'd be surprised how many surveys don't follow these guidelines and appropriate scales. So normally I don't like focusing on like the negative and saying what goes wrong, but I do feel like for looking at writing high quality survey questions, sometimes it really does help to kind of look at a question that's formatted not so great and see how we can make it better. So I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but here's an example of maybe a not so great survey question. And if you want to give some suggestions about what might not be so great about it.
I'm wondering, like, if you have been involved for 1 year, what do you put? Because you haven't been involved for less than a year, but you have not been involved for 2 years. So you kind of are just floating around.
Yes, the main not so great thing about this question was that the scale points don't align and don't necessarily capture the timeframes that people might be participating in a program. Next one, in which terms did you participate in Juntos? Select one.
It's confusing to me because they're not in chronological order. And was there a program in fall term?
Yeah, this was designed so that it was not in order. It didn't include terms. Also, I changed it to check all that apply because this is, Juntos in particular, make sure that if you're asking when someone participated, if you say if it's possible that they did more than one, make sure that they have the opportunity to check more than one, particularly on an online survey where you can build in that it's restrictive. And here's another survey question. I'll read it out. Applying for college is overwhelming. Did participating in Juntos make you feel more prepared to go to college?
It's like asking a yes or no question, but then the responses are not yes or no.
Right. It's more of a rating. I guess they're in descending order. And then it's kind of, the first line is kind of setting the stage. I mean, anyone could think that applying for college is overwhelming, but it's kind of adding, it's kind of setting the stage or making a bunch of assumptions right off the bat.
Yes, that's what you would see in evaluation manuals as a leading question is, you want to try to phrase questions as neutrally as possible. Sometimes it can be tricky because it's usually written, the survey is usually written by someone that wants the program to succeed and hopes that it's doing well. But avoiding leading questions is definitely something that you'll see a lot. And also when I redid the scale, I made the scale points so that they're a little bit more reflective of what a person's experience might be. And anything that's about feelings or how prepared you feel, there's not full consensus in the evaluation world if these are better as yes, no, as scale points, as rate on a scale from 1 to 10. There's a lot of ways you can do it, and there's not consensus in the evaluation world. I'd say, generally speaking, at least be consistent within a survey. That helps you get better data, and also I think makes it easier for the participants if they're being asked questions in a similar format. One more, which workshop did you enjoy the most and taught you the most things? And then it's asking you to pick one.
And it's also mixing the enjoyment and the learning, which are not necessarily the same.
Ding, ding, ding. Yes, so you hit the nail on the head. Again, if you're reading any sort of survey design guidebook, they will say it's usually called avoid double barrel questions, which is questions that ask more than one thing. Because maybe what you enjoyed and what you learned the most from it also wasn't particularly clearly worded either. So this might be something that if you want to know both of these things, maybe break them out into their own questions. It's also, again, be really intentional if you're asking about what you learned or what was helpful, because that can be, mean different things to a lot of folks. But, just try to make sure that you're using precise language and that you're really thinking about your audience, both in terms of like their literacy, what sort of terminology they use.
It does bring up a question, and maybe there's not really that much discussion around it, but so the one on the right, the top question on the right, so those lectures or those sessions, applying for college, understanding financial aid, and college essay, none of those sound like you're going to be having a super fun time, right? So, I mean, the campers are probably going to select, the fun parts or like the challenge course, more exciting physical things. So to put this question in your survey, you're gonna get these sessions are not going to come out as being very fun. So are you doing yourself a disservice by putting a question like that in your survey? Or, do you get what I mean?
Oh, yeah, that's a great observation. And I think that goes back to thinking about the context of what do you want to know? How do you define successful program? I mean, if you're designing something particularly around a program where you want to make filling out your FAFSA fun, then it might be an appropriate question. But if you're really, looking at enjoyment, usually there's some sort of enjoyment component if you're doing a program evaluation, but it's usually probably not asking what's fun. So, maybe that might be more appropriate for an open-ended question for, which workshops did you find most interesting or enjoyable, or did you have fun? I mean, that may be a leading question, but that's also a good example of really thinking about the purpose of your program and what you want to measure from the evaluation. Because you're right, we probably don't care if College Essay 101 is fun.
Right. I mean, we want to make it engaging as possible.
Yes.
I do kind of get hung up on this kind of thing because, I get tons of participant feedback, oh, snorkeling and rafting, is rates the top. But I also wanted, which is great to know or get that, confirmation, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to do the fun things or the less fun things. And it doesn't mean that they're really, they're having a different kind of engaging experience, but how are they learning? So anyway, I don't know if it's just a moot point or if either of you have any input, but it's just one of the little things I end up getting tripped up on.
No, that's exactly right. And I think particularly around questions around fun and enjoyment, really, what are you doing with that information?
Yeah.
Do you want to say whoever led the College Essay 101 workshop, people rated yours a 4 out of 5 fun and financial aid, you were only 3.5. Like, are you going to do anything with that
Right.
information?
Right, exactly.
And then the last one, I'll just let you read this and see if you think that something might not be great about this question. So yes, obviously, very important to think about your audience, particularly when you're surveying youth, and that could again probably be its own workshop about, and I don't personally work with very young children, so I'm not the best to, say about particular methods, but definitely think about your audience, think about your literacy, and be realistic about people's capacities for answering longer surveys or open-ended questions. Even I know that, like, and I'm a program evaluator, and after 2 open-ended questions I'm like, I'm done. Just ask me to check a box. A little bit more into the mechanics of surveys. Another stage in the survey process is review and pre-testing, and that is super important and definitely something that you want to build in time and resources for when you're planning a survey. What it looks like might, depend on the complexity of your survey, your time, your money, et cetera, but some, and you don't always have to do all of these. Again, it's context and resources dependent. Expert review, that might just be another program evaluator colleague saying, what do you think of this survey? Or, if you're asking like really technical or using validated measures or something, then you might want like someone that's really knowledgeable in that field to make sure that you're asking questions in an appropriate way. Interviewing or focus groups for the target populations of your projects could be a good way to make sure that you're using methods that they would necessarily be comfortable with, or that questions they'd be interested in asking. Pilot testing, if you do have the ability to test your survey, particularly if it's a translated survey or some other special population with a smaller group of folks, just to make sure that it again makes sense and that there's no hiccups. Because the big thing with review and pre-testing is that, especially the person that's written the survey, and this is true with anything, but I find particularly with surveys, is you don't notice ways that questions might not be worded correctly, or if the survey seems overwhelming. So any sort of review or pre-test that you're able to do, even if it's just a colleague saying, can you take this survey, you will probably get useful information. So I threw this together really quick based on the data collection plan that was shared. Ooh, and I actually worked out my timing pretty well. And I was hoping to have the last 10 minutes for our group to think about this in the context of the design question, the questions that you've already been designing. So this hopefully looks familiar because Sharcy just shared it. So this is the data collection plan. And I'm hoping that we could think about it in the context of how a survey might look like in your data collection plan. So maybe we'll just go through each of these 5 things and kind of just popcorn around some ideas of, when you're forming your evaluation question, what might that look like in a survey?
And so, Amy, are you thinking like, I guess it makes sense if we focus in on the types of evaluation questions that might be where a survey might be a good tool to answer that one? Because I'm thinking back to what you were talking about with the fun piece of it, and like, you absolutely could use a survey to do that, but there could be other ways that you're going to use observation, or you're going to, do some sort of activity that helps you understand more about where students are finding the most enjoyment at outdoor school. Okay, so we'll sort of focus in on questions that might be answered in part with a survey. Great. Thanks.
Yeah. So I threw this together really, really quick. So it's not super refined, but that's basically the evaluation question. That's where I think you start to think about, what do we want to know? How do we define success? Because that's something that Deborah was talking about as well. And then sort of methods, and you sort of started this conversation, within your questions, like what methods things might you be thinking about?
Even something as simple as like, can this question be answered through that method? Also, like, is this going to give us the sorts of, like, is this method going to allow us to collect the sorts of information that we want to collect?
Yes. And that goes back to what you were saying is, let's say for a program like Outdoor School, where your partners might want to say, are people having fun? Is a survey, because I'm sure there's some fun component, hopefully, in assessing Outdoor School, thinking about, is a survey the best method? Or if you've been, let's say you have a partner that says, I want to do a survey because that's the kind of data that I want to look at, you would probably need to think about from the other end, what of our goals or objectives are best measured by a survey. Because if, let's say, you're doing a physical activity program and they say they want a survey, you're probably not going to want to measure changes in BMI. Actually, you shouldn't be using BMI anyway. It's not a good measure, but obviously that's not something you're going to get from a survey, or not reliably get from a survey. The data gatherers, who is best suited to implement these methods? What might that look like in the context of your evaluation plans?
Yeah, I think in my case, there's several different levels of data who could provide feedback data. And I think this example question is a good one, but it seems important to me to know how the kids are doing over the course of the program. And so I think this would be a good one to just have like a daily debrief with my peer mentors who are younger and they work more closely with the youth during the program. And just to have them, kind of consider each, maybe each of their students that they're working closest with, are they tending to open up, over the course of the day, or closing down, and then why might that be? I mean, there's a judgment right there, but just some kind of just observation. But I think it would need to be the observer would need to know that they should be kind of taking mental notes, and be asked about it on a regular interval.
Yes. And you hit a good point about preparation. So if you want to make observations about who's having fun, you would maybe want to prep the camp staff ahead of time, saying we're going to be doing a debrief, so you don't surprise them with saying, how many children look like they were having fun? And they're not prepared to answer that. And then that also gets into the questions that we talked about capacity, who's the best person to design and administer the survey, again, in an outdoor school context. Maybe you're in a situation where you have a workshop that's being led by team leaders and you don't think that you want to give them that extra responsibility of doing the survey. So you would think about, all right, when do we have time that someone that we would be comfortable asking to give the survey would give the survey? Oops, I spoiled that one. Sources of information, what would be the source? I just spoiled that one, but I think we talked about that a lot already. And I want to make sure we leave a little bit of time to get to specific questions that you've developed if you want to. Again, if you want to ask a question about the parent experience, don't put that in a student survey or something unless you want to know about the student's perceptions. And logistics, we sort of covered this already, but any other logistical considerations within your questions that you think might be important to think about? Yep, we discussed most of these already, thinking about, of course, time, staff. This is a survey that's going to need to be translated in how many different languages. If it's a research study, do you need to go through the IRB, paper or online survey? If you want to give a survey in a wilderness program, you're probably not going to want to assume that you have cell phone reception, things like that. So we've got about 3.5 minutes left, and I just put this down for wrap up. And you know what? I'm going to stop sharing my screen since it's just the three of us. So I'm just going to open it back up for questions, or if there's anything, you know, in your specific plans that you've been developing, or the evaluation questions. Are there any things that you want to think about how that applies, or any questions there?
I'm thinking about doing, you know, at end of program written survey, kind of a standard thing. But I think that I also, and I'm working with high school students. So I think I might have a written worksheet, but then I think I might also have an online equivalent. So they could do it on their phones. I might get more, it might get more content. So I'm kind of stating these things, asking if anyone's got feedback. My other question is, and this, I might just use the office hours tomorrow for this. So I usually don't ever ask for any identifying information on an evaluation survey. But I have a lot of students that they will automatically put their name on it, or I say it's optional and they do it anyway. Just wondered if anyone has feedback on that.
We've seen that occasionally with the Juntos survey. We also do mixed methods. You know, we have the choice of online or paper. And even though it's very clear, this is anonymous, don't put your name, we sometimes have students, I think just out of habit, that put their name on it or sign like at the end, like, this was a great program, signed Jose Garcia. Usually, you know, we come across that, we just like, we'll black it out just to, you know, make sure that we're respecting that anonymity.
Yeah.
But it will happen.
I'm
5
just
seconds
wondering
left.
if I should make a bigger deal out of it in the introduction to the survey. Like, I really want your honest feedback. Like, really consider. You don't have to give me compliments. You don't have to, you know, make the program happy, but be honest. And so you don't have to put your name on it. Maybe emphasize that more. I don't know.
Yep, and again, that's going to, we have a minute left before we get zoomed
Okay.
out. You know, I think, you know, and again, some of this may be context dependent about how much you think it needs to be emphasized, but usually it's a good idea, especially with youth, to say, no one's getting graded on this. This is for our own knowledge. I don't find there's too much of an issue with people adding identifying information onto a survey, like writing their names. It happens occasionally. In my experience, it's not that big a problem.
Yeah.
But definitely something to be prepared for.
Okay. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much, Amy, for being here.